Oh, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, in January 2023, after a contentious election and despite an attempted insurrection by supporters of former President Bolsonaro, President Lula once again assumed the presidency of Brazil. Since then, he has been looking to enhance Brazil's position as a leader of the global South and a major player in global politics. But what are the implications of his actions for the West and the present balance of power in the world? Joining me today from Sao Paulo, Brazil, is Dr. Andre Pagliarini, a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and assistant professor of history at the Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia. He is also a columnist for the Brazilian Report and is presently working on a book about President Lula. Dr. Pagliarini, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to talking about this, incredibly complicated and important country with you.
Let me ask you this. President Lula just had a meeting with China, with the United States, but he also just had a meeting of other Latin American countries um, in which he wants to begin to foment his position as a regional player, but he also wants to be a global player. My question to you is he walking a thin line because he seems to be inching closer towards nations such as China and maybe Russia, and criticizing nations such as the United States. What's what's the bet that he's making on this strategy?
In a lot of ways, what Lula has tried to do in the first few months of his third term, he was, of course, president for two terms 20 years ago, is in a lot of ways to pick up where he left off. That includes a lot of the social policies that he's bringing back domestically, but also internationally. He's trying to reassert this vision of a Brazil that is not necessarily automatically aligned with Washington or Beijing or Moscow, but in his argument, it's a foreign policy that tries to chart its own course. If it makes sense for Brazil to deal with the European Union in one way, Washington, but yes, Moscow and Beijing as well, then that should be what Brazil does. That its priority should be Brazilian interests, not necessarily, what the Biden administration thinks or the EU thinks. Now, of course, sometimes that creates a little bit of friction. The most contentious issue so far has been around Ukraine, where Lula is very much not on the same page as the Biden administration, for example. Um, and so there have been some analyses of that question, for example, other issues as well, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, where Brazil takes a different position. Uh, Lula tries to make the point that says, look, we're not going to agree, meaning Brazil and the United States, on everything. Brazil has different interests. It can approach these countries from a different angle. It doesn't have the same history as the United States does with a lot of these countries. And so, where it makes sense for there to be an alignment between Brazil and the United States, sure, but not on everything. And it has to do with this idea of, reassuming Brazil's regional hemispheric leadership. Lula, like many Brazilian heads of state before him, believes that Brazil isn't just another country in the Americas, right? That it is a large, major country that should have a greater say in the hemisphere and in the world. This was the case when he was president last time during the so-called pink tide, where there were several progressive presidents that Lula got along with. Uh, there's a similar dynamic now with Gabriel Boric in Chile and Petro in Colombia, but things aren't quite the same. The world has changed, and so some of the challenges so far are stemming from the fact that Lula has to grapple with that the world has changed. Right? Russia today is not the Russia of 20 years ago. Putin today is not the same Putin as 20 years ago. Same with China. So that's where I think some of the challenges in terms of the foreign policy so far have come from.
Now, there has been some pushback against Lula from within some of the South American nations. I know he just had a meeting in Brazil of the Union of South American Nations. And one of the pushbacks was because Lula did somehow give cover to Maduro as some of the activities that he's been doing, and a lot of the other nations pushed back on that. What prompted Lula to defend Maduro to a certain degree? Certainly not 100%, but to a certain
Yeah.
degree. What pushed him towards that?
The critique of Lula, exactly in the case of Venezuela, is that he is being too soft on Maduro, right? That this is a leader who has imprisoned opposition members, who has shut down opposition newspapers, is governed as an authoritarian in a lot of ways. And many leaders in the region, again, I think especially the young progressive president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, said we should have no qualms about criticizing that openly. As you noted, Lula's position is a little bit different. Lula has maintained that there is very little to be gained by Brazil joining the chorus of international criticism of Maduro. I think this is the fairest way of understanding Lula's position. Some critics will say that Lula himself has authoritarian tendencies, and that's why he refuses to criticize Maduro. I'm not sure that's the best way of understanding the calculus that's going on. I think the better way to understand uh, the Brazilian foreign policy thinking here is to say, look, the whole world denounces Maduro. What's going to change if Brazil joins that? Nothing. I mean, realistically, it's not going to alter the situation much. I think Lula and his most important foreign policy advisor, Celso Amorim, who was his foreign minister last time, they think, look, if we can avoid joining the rest of the world in much of the rest of the world, not all, in condemning Maduro, maybe we can maintain credibility with the Venezuelan government that they see us as friendly enough to trust us, such that when it comes time to apply some pressure, for example, in the next election, they don't see us as just a puppet of the United States or and like that. We have the credibility to say, look, we're not uh, condemning you outright, but you have to observe the result of the election. You have to allow the election to proceed. That's what happened this week, actually, when Lula was in Europe for the summit between Latin American governments and the European Union. He had a closed door meeting between the opposition leaders of Venezuela. President Macron of France was in that meeting. President Petro of Colombia was in that meeting. And they said, we need to establish a framework where the Maduro government recognizes the upcoming election results, whether they're for or against the government, in exchange for sanctions relief. So I think that's the logic, is to say not that Brazil is going to become Venezuela, not that Lula is an authoritarian, but that how can Brazil contribute to a solution? And Lula believes it's not by joining the condemnation.
Going
It's
back
a
in your
gamble. It's a gamble, but
absolutely, it is a gamble. And I want to go back to your point about Brazil looking out for his own self-interest and perhaps thinking a little differently. It is similar to Macron, who's always looking for a different way of reacting to the United States. And it just seems to me that when you say Macron was in the room at the time, that the two of them seem to have a similar way of thinking when it comes to how to deal with the West. Macron is not always on board with the United States, and he is often a thorn in the side of the administration. And so they seem to have that similar way of thinking when it comes to global events. Uh, but the other thing I want to ask you is, but how far does Lula want to take this? Because one of the things he is proposing is looking at a different currency when it comes to trade, particularly within the BRICS association, and which doesn't play well in Washington, as you well know. So, how far is he willing to take that, which many people see as anti-West rhetoric?
yeah, I think both Lula and Macron, for different reasons, as you point out, have this sense that the world in the next, I don't know, 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 years, medium to long term, will be a less US centric world, right? That the era of the United States being the major global power is nearing an end, right? With, of course, China and situation, right? I mean, the world is changing. And for different reasons, they both want to stake out a position. From the Brazilian point of view, and this is not consensus, right? There are obviously differences of opinion, but former President Bolsonaro had a very different foreign policy. But I think Lula's point of view is that Brazil, as I said, Brazil is a major hemispheric player. It should be a major global player. And it's not, I don't think it's a hostility towards the United States, but it's a sense that um, Brazil has long wanted, for example, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And Lula figures, we've been getting promises from the United States for many, many years that we would have a greater say in issues, and it never happened. So, you know what? Maybe we need to chart a different course, whether that's finding allies in France with Macron, in relations with China. You asked how far will he go with that? I don't. I think it's very unlikely that there would be a moment where Lula sort of openly breaks with the United States or closes the door to the United States, and just because the United States is too much of an important partner commercially for Brazil. Next year, 2024 will mark the bicentenary of U.S. recognition of Brazilian independence in 1824. So that I imagine will be a kind of friendly, occasion. But the flip side of that Lula is committed to saying we are not necessarily aligned with what the United States' vision of the world order is. Lula keeps insisting, for example, that the problem in the Russia's war against Ukraine is just the latest example of a UN Security Council country violating international law. He said a few months ago, "Look, this is what George W. Bush did with the invasion of Iraq. Putin invading Ukraine is just another symptom of these powerful countries who don't think international law applies to them." And he sees that as an argument for rethinking international governance, rethinking, multilateral institutions. So I don't foresee it, developing into like a hostile relationship with Washington, but I don't think he's going to back down either. I think he's going to stay on this line that, look, if we're serious about deepening democracy worldwide, including third world voices in international governance, we need to put sort of our money where our mouth is. And as you noted, that's not always pleasing for Washington to hear.
Right. I mean, one of the things he has put forth is his idea of the peace club when it comes to the war in Ukraine, which some folks have dismissed because it really, given the non-alignment policy of Brazil, a lot of people believe that the Peace Club initiative doesn't really fit that because the countries that would be involved in that do have an interest, whether it's China, which clearly has an interest of being on the side of Russia, or at least being against the United States. How do you see that playing out in the coming months, or perhaps years, depending upon how long this war goes?
That reminds me of a part of your question that I forgot to address last time, which is about the currency, of a potential kind of new currency to be used within the BRICS. The idea there being similar to what you're just getting at, a way to work around the United States. Lula has said that it doesn't make sense that so much of international trade is dominated by the dollar, that you have to use the dollar to buy to buy it and sell commodities on the international market, that there could be a currency uh, that certain countries could use to work around that dollar dominance. Again, not pleasing for Washington. The idea of the Peace Club is a similar one. It's to say that, in fact, Lula said this week when he was in Ukraine. He said, "Look, we all know the United States position on Russia's war against Ukraine. We all know what the EU thinks, but there are, you know, uh, several countries that don't fit neatly into either a clearly sort of pro-Russian or pro-US EU stance." And Lula has consistently argued that those countries that don't necessarily want to involve themselves directly in the war should have a more prominent role in trying to negotiate an end to the war. That's gone nowhere. It's gone nowhere since Lula was inaugurated. So much so that I think my kind of sense, uh, based on what he said, is that he's kind of giving up a little bit on that initiative. He doesn't quite talk about it as much. He was a little bit frustrated um, that it didn't go anywhere. And so I think what's motivating Lula in this third term on the in terms of foreign policy, he wants a major initiative. He wants to be able to say, we've done this big thing. I think he hoped it would be negotiating peace in the war in Ukraine. As I say, I kind of sense that that's fading a little bit. And so another initiative he's talked about lately with the EU is a major new initiative to tackle hunger uh, uh, in poorer parts of the world. So part of what I think is going on as well, not to say it's just ego, but part of what I think is going on too is he wants to do something big. He has this kind of international standing that I think he wants to use to do something big and positive to kind of cap off his, prominent political career. I think that's
One of
part
the
of what's going on too.
Absolutely, and a part of it is his position in terms of the Amazon, which also gives him tremendous leverage when it comes to climate change and policies around that. And I know in his recent meeting with President Biden has committed to give money towards the Amazon fund. How do you see Lula using that part to also position himself as a major political player?
That's a great point as well. It's sort of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of Lula differentiating himself from his predecessor, Bolsonaro, has to do with the environmental question. Bolsonaro presided over, some really devastating rates of deforestation that raised alarm among European leaders, among the United States, that said basically, look, Brazil has within its national territory the vast majority of the Amazon, the world's largest, rainforest, that it has a duty not only to itself but really to the world to protect. So when Lula came into office, he said very clearly, I think of his first 10 major sort of day one directives, the things he could do through executive orders, five of them pertain to environmental matters. To say we're going to step up the enforcement of, cracking down on environmental crimes, all these things. This is like the easy stuff in terms of international standing. I mean, day one, he did all this stuff. The world said, boy, what a relief to have someone back in power who takes seriously this obligation of protecting the Amazon. That's the easy stuff. Also, one thing that Lula has tried to leverage in the world stage is Brazil's standing as one of the cleanest environmental, cleanest energy producers in the world. The majority of Brazil's energy comes from clean sources, especially hydropower, major waterfalls, things like that. And so he's tried to say, in this regard, Brazil can and should be a world leader as well. So this gets to what I was saying. I think Lula is looking for ways to project himself, but Brazil internationally to say, again, we are a major country. We have technological sophistication. We know how to produce green energy and all these things. We should have a bigger say. We should be a more prominent player in the world on this incredibly pressing question of the environment. So that's a great example too, where he's tried to say we are different than our predecessor. We should not just be sort of being patted on the head by the United States and European Union. We want to have a seat at the table of these major negotiations. So much so that the next COP, the UN environmental meeting, I think in 2025, if I'm not mistaken, will be held in Brazil. So another showcase for this status.
Now, with all of these things that Lula wants to do, whether it's trade, whether it's Peace Club, whether that's going anywhere or not, the Amazon, yet his standing at home is pretty low. It's in the 30s in terms of his approval rating. Why is that? Because he has been a popular figure, particularly in his last administration. Why hasn't that translated into greater approval ratings at home? As we know, all politics is local.
Right. This is a matter of some debate. So first of all, Brazil, like the United States, incredibly polarized, left and right. And one of the arguments Lula made in the campaign last year was that what was necessary to defeat Bolsonaro, who he characterized, I think, fairly as an extreme figure, it's fine to have, conservative and liberal and all that, but that Bolsonaro was just an extremist, right? He was beyond the pale. What was necessary was a broad coalition of sort of centrist forces, even moderate conservatives with the left. And that worked out. That was the winning coalition. And so to your question, many people said, well, he eked out a win. And it's true that the election was very, very close. But the argument I've been making about that is, yes, it was very, very close. And it's not like Lula came to power with this massive mandate. At the same time, no president has ever lost re-election in Brazil. So this was, it's not nothing that Lula was able to defeat the incumbent. That had never happened before.
Mhm.
So that's a major win. Um, Now, his current popularity, I think every time he talks about these kind of thorny questions, Venezuela, for example, Ukraine, it has not been good for him politically. That's in part why I think he's sort of backing off the Ukraine peace deal thing, is that, it's not adding to his sort of political standing. That said, there was a poll that came out this week or last week, I can't recall, that showed the public's confidence in the president, not necessarily the approval rating, but the public's confidence in the president at the highest rating in many years. I think it was at 56% of Brazilians say they have confidence in the president. So that's, if Lula is looking for a cup half full sort of perspective, the climate in the country, the political climate has clearly, the temperature has gone down since Bolsonaro left office. I think people are seeing politics, for better or for worse, working as normal. It's sometimes these kind of shady deals need to be made, but I think people recognize that that's politics and that's playing out as normal, as it were. And so I think part of that status of people expressing a kind of degree of confidence in Lula is that whatever one thought about Bolsonaro, at least now there's a government that is willing to negotiate. Lula is a great negotiator, and that the country seems to be on a more stable path than it was under Bolsonaro, where Brazil became kind of an international pariah. Nobody wanted to be seen with Bolsonaro. Nobody wanted to talk to Brazil. It was a really stunning period of isolation.
And just to piggyback on that, but his financial secretary, Fernando Haddad, is enjoying great approval, which is always interesting to me because he works for President Lula. So, and I
Mm-hmm.
know Fernando Haddad has had he was mayor and he ran for governor of Sao Paulo, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is he a political threat to Lula at any point?
So Haddad was also, as you mentioned, mayor. He ran for governor last year. He was the presidential candidate for the Workers' Party in 2018. He lost to Bolsonaro after Lula was not allowed to run, being in prison. The idea of anyone in the Workers' Party as a threat to Lula is a non-starter because he is so dominant within. This is part of the criticism. He is so dominant within the party that no one would think to butt heads with him in a serious way. Uh, the better way to think about it is as Lula's heir, right? So if during last year's campaign, Lula said he would not seek another term in 2026. He has since opened the door a little bit to that. But if he sticks to it and does not run, I don't think there's anybody else in the Workers' Party with the standing other than Haddad to run for president again for the PT, for the Workers' Party. He's been, as you said, you know, incredibly successful in pushing through Lula's economic agenda um, so far this year. I mean, for example, he passed a major new reform of the tax code. Still has to be approved by the Senate, but everyone expects that it will be. That presidents have been trying for 40 years to simplify what is one of the world's most complicated tax codes. I mean, it's incredibly complicated to start a business in Brazil, to close a business in Brazil, to hire and fire, because of this kind of arcane tax system. This will simplify that tremendously, bringing Brazil in line with major economies in the world. People expect that to do, to deliver some real economic growth for the country. If it's easier for foreign companies to put money in Brazil, the argument is jobs will follow, good news, all that stuff. So I really think Haddad is positioning himself. Granted, we're still in the first year. We'll see what happens with the economy, but he's positioning himself to say, "Look, I am a progressive. I'm in the Workers' Party and all that stuff. but I'm also fiscally responsible. I am not a crazy kind of going to spend Brazil. This is the argument he'll make because the other major reform, I mentioned the tax reform. The other one was a new fiscal framework for Brazil, basically, capped on spending to show that Brazil is serious about being on fiscal, sure footing. So he's clearly, I think, positioning himself to follow Lula eventually. I mean, eventually Lula will leave the stage, and I think Haddad is the best positioned to follow him.
I want to pick back up on the international arena for a moment. Um, Even as Lula is looking to get closer to China in terms of trade, direct investment, and the like, there's also been an investigation into China for alleged dumping practices. How does that affect what Lula is trying to do? Because he's trying to be friendly with Beijing, and now this investigation, which has been, I believe, people have called for a while before Lula got there. But how does this interrupt what he's trying to do?
I don't think there's very much that honestly China could do or that sort of could come up that would interrupt Lula's hopes for deepening ties with China. He said something earlier this year on his first trip to China as president that really stood out to me. He said, "Look, when I'm in Washington, I don't worry about what Beijing thinks about me being there. The same is true when I'm in China. I don't worry about what Washington says when I'm in China. I'm here discussing the sovereign interests of my country, and so be it." China recently surpassed the United States as Brazil's number one trade partner. It had been the United States for many many years. And now it's China. Uh, One way of seeing that sort of concretely is that in Brazil has been undergoing for at least 20 years now, major wave of deindustrialization.
Mhm.
So, car plants, for example, major factories are shutting down and leaving the country. China, I forget the name of the company, but one of the largest clean, electric vehicle companies that's Chinese, just announced major plans to expand operations in Brazil. So that's a clear example of this dynamic we're talking about, where China is stepping in to fill this void of direct investment that Brazil has undergone. And so the fact that China is going to be creating jobs, opening factories, and all this stuff in Brazil, I think makes it very hard that Lula would, back off or pick a fight. For better or for worse, I think China is a friend, a partner that, as I said in my first comment, I don't think Lula wants to say at any point, look, we are with China, turn our back on the United States. He wants to keep both. He wants to keep trade with China, keep trade with the United States. The question, I think, overriding our whole conversation here is whether that's possible, whether he can walk this tightrope, or whether we're entering a new Cold War, in the next few years, in which you have to pick sides. Lula and Brazil emphatically say we refuse to pick sides.
But you, as an historian, and you know Brazil well, and you know the politics well, and the point that you just made, at some point, he's going to have to, or whoever is in power in Brazil is going to have to make a choice because hopefully China and the United States will avoid the Thucydides trap. Hopefully we won't have that. But at some point, there's going to have to be a decision made. Number one, what do you think is going to be the process by which Brazil makes that decision? And where do you think they would come? Which side do you think they would come down on?
So here, I do think it's instructive to think about the Cold War, where in 1964 a military coup occurred, where the armed forces very much aligned with how the United States, kind of an anti-communist force, said that the president in power, João Goulart, in 1964, was progressive, a leftist, who was either too soft on the communists and the left, or was a closet communist himself. And so in any event, they said he needs to go. So in 1964, the military, with the support of President Lyndon Johnson at the time, stepped in, installed a dictatorship that lasted 21 years, that for the most part was pro-U.S., anti-communist. There was a moment where the military made a decision. Right, we are firmly in the capitalist world against a president who had said, as Lula says now, we refuse to take sides. We are going to negotiate with the Soviet Union, with China, with the United States. Didn't work. I mean, it didn't work out too well. We had a period of dictatorship. Lula, as I mentioned, is trying to insist now that we need not Brazil need not repeat that tragic era. That we are friends with the United States, we are friends with China. As you say, there might be a moment of reckoning in the years to come. We all hope that it doesn't come to war, of course, at any point between the United States and China. But as one of the points that the Bolsonaro government made before Lula was exactly this. His foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo, frequently said, let's not get things twisted. We are pro-free market. We are, democracy and open markets. China is not that. The Bolsonaro government was much more hostile towards China in its rhetoric in a lot of ways. And that hurt Brazil in some instances. For example, during the pandemic, when vaccines needed to be purchased, many of them with, produced in China, Brazil was kind of put at the bottom of the list of priorities for China. So, will Brazil have to make a choice at some point? I think it will depend on who is in power, not only in Brazil, but also in the United States. There's no doubt in my mind that January 8th, which you mentioned at the beginning, this insurrection of Bolsonaro supporters in Brasilia, that whole thing might have gone differently were Donald Trump president. So I think part of this chess game about what Brazil and its loyalties, and its interests, how it perceives its interests, will also depend on who is leading the United States. We have a sense of who will be leading China. I don't think Xi Jinping is going anywhere, but I think it'll depend also on the United States. To its credit, in my own view, to its credit, the Biden administration, at least publicly, is not forcing the Lula government to pick sides. If you notice, I mean, in much of the coverage of the Ukraine situation, of the China situation, pundits have criticized Lula. Say, well, is he really a Democrat? Whose side is he on? The Biden administration has not. They said Brazil is a partner, is an ally. We are committed to working on the areas in which we agree. I think that's the right approach because, judging from the Cold War history, I think bad things happen when you give countries ultimatums, right? I think you create the condition for sometimes violence, but also, you close the terms of debate if you force countries to pick sides. So I think, as we said several times, it's a gamble. Lula's position is a gamble, but to the credit of the United States under this administration, he's not been pushed against the wall.
In the few minutes we have remaining, as you said at the beginning, the world is changing. Um, Nations are not the same. The United States is not the same. Russia's not the same. China's not the same. Lula is a multilateralist, whereas Bolsonaro was more of an isolationist. But if you were to predict out, regardless, let's say, of who's in the United States, where do you see Brazil in terms of its position as a regional player and a global player over the next 4 to 5 years?
I think whatever happens in the next presidential election, 2026 in Brazil, uh, Brazil will remain the most important player in Latin America and especially South America. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine another country sort of supplanting Brazil in the region. It's the largest country by far, right? It's like 10 times the population of Chile, for example. And so, for better or for worse, leaders in the Americas will have to contend with Brazil when it comes, for example, a specific example. Lula is trying to negotiate as the rotating head of Mercosur, which is the common trade market for South America, a deal with the European Union, right? A trade deal between South American countries and the European Union. I'm sorry, with China. Uruguay, small, tiny little Uruguay, is trying to negotiate its own deal, trade deal with China. Big, giant Brazil is saying, not so fast. We need to negotiate as a region, not as individuals. So in that sense, we get, it's a clear example of a major country, Brazil, trying to rein in the much smaller Uruguay. So whatever happens, Brazil will be a major player in the hemisphere. What remains to be seen is the extent to which it can sort of flex its influence in the broader geopolitical stage. Lula, I think, he's hitting up against the kind of ceiling where he says we want to be listened to on these major issues. We have valuable insights. We can contribute in ways that the United States cannot, just because of the United States' history in the world. But there's not a lot of willingness from the United States to accommodate. And there have been several authors, non-historians. I've seen, I think, Fareed Zakaria make this argument, and many others that say the United States in the medium to long term is going to have to make some accommodation. It doesn't have the influence, the weight that it did 50 years ago. It has to let in these other voices. So that's a potentially difficult transition, kind of multilateral age, as opposed to an age of American hegemony. I think whoever's in power in Brazil in the next decade, will generally speaking, be committed to a similar line. They might change at the margin, but I think Brazil has long craved a bigger position in the world affairs, and whoever wins in the next few years, I think, will be in that direction as well. Brazil wants to have more influence over global governance, not be just a regional power. It wants to impact, discussions everywhere. And I think Brazilians would argue we have the legitimacy. We're a peaceful country. Brazilians would say we have green technology, all these things. We should be listened to.
Lurking not too far behind is the shadow of Bolsonaro, even though he can't run until 2030, I believe it is.
That's
But
right.
still, he's in the shadows. How are people responding to that? Because Bolsonaro does have a large constituency in Brazil. We know what happened in January 2023. How is that going to play in the internal politics of Brazil over the coming years?
One of the things I'm comforted by is that the leading contenders to run as the right-wing candidate, the candidate of the right in 2026, none of them have the open hostility to Brazilian institutions and Brazilian democracy that Bolsonaro had for decades. So two of the leading contenders are the governors of São Paulo and the governor of Minas Gerais. Major states, both are conservative guys, but they're political figures. They're governors. They're working within their respective states with people who disagree with them. Bolsonaro never expressed a willingness to work with those who disagreed with. He would just, say that they're crooks or that they're bad. He didn't recognize that people disagree and that there's different ways to come to an understanding. That his ineligibility, the fact that he can't run until 2030, I think is a huge sigh of relief for anyone who cares about democracy in Brazil. I think there's no other way to put it. The fact that he has a strong constituency, it's true. I mean, there are plenty of people who say, that democracy itself might not be worth preserving if Lula keeps winning and so on. But I really strongly believe that many, 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 many of those who voted for Bolsonaro were not on board with any attempt to undermine the foundations of Brazilian democracy. And that, again, I think it's a comfort that, there are plenty of people who disagree with Lula, as you mentioned, his polling and all that. But as long as the boundaries there, the democratic boundaries in Brazil, as in the United States, as long as those boundaries are respected, I think Brazil will continue gradually, little by little,
to become a less unequal country, right? It's still a grossly unequal, poverty and immense poverty, but also immense wealth. I think little by little, it will continue to become a more equal, more prosperous, and I do think more influential country.
Our guest today has been Dr. Andre Pagliarini, a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and assistant professor of history, Hampden-Sydney College. And we hope to be reading his book soon on President Lula, which we hope to be coming out in 2024. And I want to thank him for being our guest today on the Aguilar Conversations. And join us again next week as we have another issue of international interest and concern here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.